Be informed, be inspired. Join us for the Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond show. Tune in and listen for both modern and ancient wisdom on all things maternity, parenting and sacred women's business. Right here on the Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond show.
You're tuned into Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond, where stories, science, tradition and new ideas meet. Today we are delving into the effects of fertility on relationships. I'm Kimberley Lipschus and welcome to the show today.
I remember in my personal experience, my husband would come home from work every day, and the first thing he'd do is pick up his broom, and he would start sweeping or he'd put stuff away. And he felt that things were very much out of order in our life, and he had to put things back in order in his life. I, on the other hand, was feeling a whole lot of feelings and couldn't understand why he was doing this. And then suddenly, as we talked one day, he said, talking about it doesn't help me. He had to feel like he was doing something. And as I processed it, I really understood a lot better.
Sharon Covington. Sharon is an assistant clinical professor at Georgetown University, School of Medicine in Washington, D.C. She's also the Director of Psychological Support at Shady Grove Fertility and is an active professional member of Resolve, the National Infertility Association in the US. She's edited a number of books. Sharon's career trajectory, as you just heard, was flipped on its head after going through her own pregnancy losses. What are fertility challenges? A woman may be trying to fall pregnant. Another may have recently endured a miscarriage. This is actually a deeply private journey for most women and couples, but what about the relationship? Today we're going to investigate the pitfalls of a relationship that is undergoing fertility challenges. What happens to the relationship? How do you both endure these times? And what are some tips on making it through stronger and more unified as a couple? How did you get into doing what you do? Because it's very fascinating, your line of work, Sharon.
I was a therapist, an adult therapist. I did individual and couples work. And during that time, I started my family. And I ended up having two premature births, early stillbirths, and a miscarriage in between the birth of my oldest child and my middle child. And at the time I went through those experiences, there were no books, there were no resources, there were no support groups, there was no information out there on this experience that I had been through with pregnancy loss. And I had certainly knew about grief and loss, but there was nothing that quite compared to the kinds of feelings that I was having from this. And as a result, I ended up starting a support group in the Washington, D.C. area for people who had had pregnancy losses, and started speaking at hospitals and to medical groups about this experience and about the kind of intervention that needed to take place at hospitals to help couples as they go through it and to facilitate grief.
One thing you've said is that relationships have to be tended to like a garden, which is such a beautiful analogy, and that garden tends to be laid aside during the fertility challenges. How have you seen that manifest, especially for people not just going through IVF but who have fertility challenges?
I think the fertility challenges, as you say, the fertility challenges becomes the focus of their life, and it becomes the forest, and they can't see the trees. It takes over their life. Again, for women, it tends to preoccupy them throughout the day because they're very, very conscious of their body and what is taking place in their body. Again, men tend to be more detached from that because fertility treatment doesn't focus on that. So it takes on a life of its own. And, we really have to help them in some ways compartmentalize it at times, be able to put it aside so that they can focus on the things that really are important in their life and in their marriage, as well as the other things that are important.
And compartmentalising is often a strength in men, and we could take a little page out of their books in these situations sometimes.
Yes, yeah, it can be an effective coping strategy. If that's the only way you deal with things, it becomes a defense and isn't necessarily useful in the long run. But being able to, in some ways, appreciate the ways our partner might cope with something, and rather than criticize it but appreciate it, can help in strengthening the relationship too.
And I guess if children do come along, it will be very helpful in that situation as well, because that's a stressor in itself.
It's a very good point. I often, talk to people about the fact that the kinds of strategies they learn during this time that they're trying to have a baby will be lifelong strategies. When they come into counseling, we start talking about it. These are going to be skills that are going to help them talk when they're dealing with other difficult times in their life, or when they're struggling with their kids and what to do about it. So it's an opportunity. With each crisis that we face in life, there are opportunities, and this can become an opportunity too that we can learn from.
You're tuned in to Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond with me, Kimberley Lipschus, and today we're talking about relationships during fertility challenges, the impacts of them when you go through fertility stress of any kind. Over many years in Sharon Covington's practice in the US, she noticed the stress that these couples were going through and how it affected their relationship. She also noticed some significant themes in the couples over the years, and you may want to pay close attention to what she has noticed.
Bonding does not really come together for men and women until birth occurs. Women start bonding much earlier because of the physical changes that are taking place in their body during pregnancy. But if you look at graphs that kind of depict this, it really doesn't come together until birth. So I think for men, sometimes it's much more an intellectual exercise, as you say. But for women, again, they're so tuned in to what is going on in their bodies that it is ever present in their life.
And a hypervigilance. It can create a hypervigilance.
Yes. That's very descriptive. They become hypervigilant over their body. I think what happens, what I've seen in situations like that, I can think of one offhand where she was so focused on wanting to get pregnant that he ended up talking about feeling like he was a sperm donor. That what he saw about things wasn't really important. The input that he had as far as what was going on in regards to treatment wasn't important. His own sexual needs besides having sex to have babies wasn't important. That's one example of the kind of thing that can come up.
I call it the roll out the stallion, roll out the whore moment. So she does that dance of like, oh, I don't want to do this, so overarches her sexuality. He sees it and feels like he's the rolling out the stallion, and that dynamic can be really painful and quite toxic.
Yes, yeah. Infertility puts this terrible stress on a couple's sexual relationship. And it's one of the things, of course, we talk about in the couples work is how to kind of bring some of that warmth and caring and intimacy back into it. The other thing that I feel very strongly about is what often happens is, people are going through this treatment and everything is focused on baby making, so it becomes work. And then when they become pregnant, they are often too afraid to have sex because they're afraid they might jiggle something or something might happen. There can be no medical reason why they shouldn't, but they are so fearful of doing anything wrong. And then once they have their baby, they are too tired to have sex. And so they end up coming into my office 3 or 4 years later saying, we're not having sex anymore, we're not close, we're doing different things, we're just paying attention to our kids, we're not doing anything else. They're in a marital crisis. So one of the things I feel strongly about is that when we help people who have become successful with medical treatment exit the clinic, that we really need to talk to them about this piece, about how they need to reclaim their sexual relationship as another way of feeling close and communicating.
And I'm guessing that stress, is particularly in the States with IVF, is a money stressor, would be a huge issue.
Financial stress is a huge piece of this. And I know in Australia, it's different, the kinds of financial issues that patients feel because there's mandated coverage depending on where you're going. But it's a huge issue for people. And I've seen people, incur tremendous debt, in their means of trying to have a family. In fact, I think that becomes one of our goals as a counselor is helping people come to a place where they can, decide when is enough. Because oftentimes it isn't their medical professionals who are doing that, because there's always another treatment that can be offered, another option that can be. And today, age isn't even a limit to it. When I started out doing this work, menopause was the natural age. It was before egg donation. And menopause was and after that, there weren't any other options for women. Today, you can get pregnant depending on where you go for treatment at any age.
What happens when you say, okay, guys, I think maybe you should think about taking a break? What happens to a couple when there's a time?
Well, first of all, we have to talk about what feels comfortable to them. I mean, a break can be a month, a break can be 6 months. When you're talking about a pregnancy loss, I really encourage people to take at least 6 months before they consider starting again. And I don't even think 6 months is long enough. When you're talking about, just going through treatment failure after treatment failure, sometimes even just taking a month off, where they truly leave the treatment behind and they do other things, can be helpful. When people start to get anxious about the age thing, I try to bring a little reality into it. In other words, if you're 40 and you take 6 months off, it's different than if you're 30 and you take 6 months off. And so, again, just kind of a month here and a month there isn't going to make a huge difference in quality of someone's eggs or the ability to get pregnant. But there's a lot of pressure. There's no doubt they feel a lot of pressure as they're going through this. It can be internally because of their age or what they hear. It can be from family and friends. It can be from their physicians sometimes.
And you've been listening to Sharon Covington talking about the stress that infertility and fertility challenges have on a relationship. Let's hear a little bit from Sharon now.
Yes, men and women do cope differently, not only because of their gender, but because they're different people. They've been raised by different parents. They have different experiences, so they bring into the experience of reproductive loss a different perspective. Typically, women tend to need to talk much more about their experience. They are kind of much more out there with their emotions. They use communication and talking as kind of the fabric of the way they work through things. Men typically tend to be much more action-oriented. They are kind of much more caught up in their thoughts than necessarily their feelings about it. They need to feel like there are things that they can do, take action to something as opposed to really talking about it. So certainly with the work with our couples, one of the basic things that we do is to try to help couples accept and understand that they're different and that they feel differently, but that different doesn't mean better or worse. It just means not the same.
Because it can cause conflict. That different without the support, it can cause the conflict. As a theme, the woman wants to speak, and the man wants to fix, and the woman just wants to be heard. Is that something
Correct.
that you've seen?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's something that we work on all the time, and sometimes it's with very simple strategies about helping men learn how to listen and to ask questions and to reflect back feelings without coming up with what the answer is. The other thing I think we need to do is we need to help women appreciate what it's like from a man's perspective of what their husbands are going through.
And in same-sex couples and single women, because they have support people as well, and there's a dynamic and a tension. What have you seen in both of those categories of women who are going through fertility challenges?
Well, in same-sex couples, again, you have two different people coming together. They may be of the same sex or gender, but they're not. They come from different